Welcome to this episode of the Politics Shed podcast, where I discuss various aspects of politics relating to the A-level politics course. These podcasts support the work I do on my website, also known as the Politics Shed, and if you haven't looked at it, please do. This podcast is about neoliberalism, and is part of the ideologies section of the A-level course. Of course, if you're not doing A-level, and you just wish to find out about neoliberalism, or you're interested in politics, I hope you enjoy it as well. Where to start with neoliberalism? It's a term I'm sure you're familiar with. It'll be used as an insult. It'll be used pejoratively. It'll be used as a label for things that are not good at the moment in the world, and will mean something like rampant capitalism, selfishness, marketization, and so on. It would be fair to say that neoliberalism is one of the dominant ideas of the last 50 years. For half a century, and steadily growing in significance, neoliberalism has pervaded every aspect of our society, that is to say the UK, Western Europe, much of the world, and certainly the United States. So, finding out about where it started and what its origins are is really quite a good exercise for anyone who wants to understand the world that we are currently living in. Where to start? Well, as with all ideas, you could go back in time an awful long way and find threads of thought that led to it. I'll start, as most textbooks do, with Adam Smith and classical liberalism. We're heading back then to the Enlightenment, to the 18th century, when people like Newton and Smith, and philosophers of all kinds, and economists like Ricardo, began to devise an understanding not only of economics and science and astronomy, but also politics. And the Enlightenment period might be seen as a period in history when, as the term Enlightenment suggests, people began to see the world more clearly, or at least they thought they did, or hoped they did. In this clarity of thought, they felt that reason, logic, mathematics, and science could expose reality and do away with mysticism, religion to some extent, or at least the more superstitious and mythical elements of religion, or at least park it to one side. God, as it were, became more universal and less specific. It was in this context that the Scottish philosopher, writer, and economist Adam Smith wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. Adam Smith set out to demonstrate that while protectionist policies create barriers, free trade aims to establish connections. The prevailing 18th century economic principles were dominated by ideas of mercantilism, the belief which emphasized the importance of gold and silver reserves for a nation's prosperity, and this was challenged by Adam Smith. Mercantilism was, in hindsight, from the perspective of our current times, a very odd idea. We have accepted fairly universally ideas of free trade and so on. It seems very antediluvian. Mercantilism suggested that nations were, like we might imagine today, in competition with each other, but it operated in a strange sort of way. Nations should restrict imports, not buy goods from other countries as much as humanly possible. They should sell, however, their own goods as much as humanly possible. In so doing, by selling but not buying, they accrue wealth to themselves in terms of gold reserves and silver reserves, which they can then use to develop strong armies. This idea of the self-sufficient country, but somehow trading with all others, you can see it makes no sense. It was, in other words, a recipe for economic decay. So in a sense, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, is knocking at an open door. It wouldn't have taken much to expose the flaws of mercantilism. He proposed that instead, unrestricted free trade, or as free trade as trade could be free, would benefit all nations. Now, you might say this wasn't immediately obvious, since goods coming from abroad might indeed damage domestic industries. And this is going to be true. As we shall see, free trade doesn't come without a downside. Anyway, unrestricted free trade, generally speaking, would benefit all nations. Restrictive practices, guilds, and protectionist measures, such as were common under mercantilism, would be less successful. Probably the term you've most heard and associated with Adam Smith is the invisible hand. This idea, often quoted, is that free trade economics, based on principles of a free market, supply and demand, when operating under their own invisible rules, seem to operate as though someone were actually guiding the economy. The invisible hand ensures that more of what is needed, or desired, or demanded is produced, and less of that thing which is not so in demand, whether it's labour, the cost of working wages, or goods, or services. This invisible hand on the tiller of the economy worked far more efficiently than any human intervention. You can see that Adam Smith to this day will be seen as a patron saint of libertarianism, of unrestricted free trade, and all the horrors and downsides that go with it. Greed is good, and so on. And it's true that while Smith praised self-interest for driving economic advancement, in other words, individual desires and greed could lead to collective good, he did not support a completely unregulated market. And this is often forgotten and misunderstood. He was a moralist. He criticized the behavior of the wealthy for their arrogance and excessive desires for wealth. Adam Smith was essentially, as I said, an 18th century moralist. He thought the market could be justified only in light of individual virtue. And he was anxious that a society governed by nothing but transactional self-interest was no society at all. In that sense, you can see Adam Smith not only as the patron saint of unrestricted free trade, but also modern ideas of liberalism and one-nation conservatism, a society of obligations and responsibilities. It's also important to understand the fact that political liberals share an agenda of liberty with economic liberals is therefore one of the most crucial resources for the authority of neoliberalism. So, as we shall see, neoliberalism may be averse to government, but not morality. Essentially, neoliberalism is a utopian ideology, for all of its harsh and ruthless-sounding economics. This aspect of neoliberalism is beautifully analysed in a recent book by Dr. Abby Innes, who explains in that book the surprising parallel world of neoliberalism and Soviet communism in her book, Late Soviet Britain. Here's Dr. Innes describing some of her ideas.
Is because they're mirror image utopias, when you've got to translate the ideology into a procedure, they converge on exactly the same statecraft. In 1902, Vilfredo Pareto, the economist, had said, as a matter of purely sort of formal logic, the perfectly efficient free market and the perfectly efficient social planner, total social planning, are mirror images. They're just different coordinating systems to get to the idea that you can have a perfect balance of supply and demand in an economy so that welfare is maximized. Now, when he said that in 1902, it was a purely formal thought experiment. But that mirroring was what would come to haunt first the Stalinist system in the 1950s, when there is an attempt to build total command planning, and decades later, neoliberalism, when we attempt to transform the British economy according to the idea that if the state withdraws, there will be a revealed prophecy of rational, calculating individuals who can navigate their way perfectly in the free market space, constrained only by taste and technology and resources that they can change if they just choose to apply that rationality according to their sort of preferences. Because this is a kind of revealed prophecy from the neoclassical economics, then when you strip away the distortions of the state, the fog of communitarian lies, then people will conform and you will liberate them that the true republic is the free market. And in that sense, democracy and democratic institutions become far less significant, because the idea that true liberty, the true space of liberty, is how we navigate our way, guided by the providential light of the price mechanism.
The providential light of the price mechanism. Wonderful. So, as Dr. Innes points out, neoliberalism is a utopian ideology, not unlike Soviet central planning. In this sense, like the Soviets, the neoliberalists thought they'd broken through into the sunlit uplands where they discovered how it all works. This is what capitalism does. It is, in effect, the end of history. So, a quick history. Neoliberalism emerged as an idea in the late 1930s and continued into the 1940s, with influential figures such as economists Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, later on, that is, with Friedman, leading the way. The Chicago School economists, the Chicago Boys as they were sometimes referred to. Friedrich Hayek wrote in 1936 that he knew with a conviction of a sudden illumination that he'd struck upon something new. He wrote, "How can the combination of fragments of knowledge existing in different minds bring about results which, if they were to be brought about deliberately, would require a knowledge on the part of the directing mind which no single person can possess?" In other words, an invisible hand. Essentially, this is a restatement of the enormous power and efficiency of free markets when left to their own devices. Initially, these writers, many of whom were exiled from Nazi-occupied lands during the Second World War, were marginalized. This was a sideline view, as we shall see. They were reacting strongly against the super-state interventionist aspects of fascism, but primarily they targeted socialism in their critique. They viewed socialism, especially as it was seen in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as more pervasive and dangerous an ideology compared to fascism, which they saw as a passing trend. Rooted in classical liberal principles, neoliberals emphasized individual freedom through the removal of restrictions, particularly in economic matters. They believed that free markets would enhance individual freedom, focusing on the economy as an agent of liberty. So you can see already that this isn't just an economic idea. It's about human nature, the kind of society that is virtuous and good to live in. While neoliberals have tended to align politically with the right, defining themselves in opposition to the left, the ideology itself was not inherently right-wing and could be embraced by governments across the political spectrum. A libertarian in the USA today, advocating free speech and free trade, might also advocate the sale and consumption of drugs, marijuana, as well as guns, and so on. It sits outside of the traditional moralities of the right. So libertarians, for instance, are often quite content that women should be able to choose whether to have an abortion or carry guns, but also not pay taxes and have a very limited form of government. Not always easy to place that on a left-right spectrum. Neoliberalism sees itself promoting human well-being, as I said, by enhancing entrepreneurial freedoms and skills, strong private rights, free markets, and free trade. According to this perspective, the state's role is to establish and uphold an institutional structure conducive to such practices. They saw the state's role as creating the conditions for a free market in the prevention of monopolies, ensuring a stable monetary order. The concept of the social market meant ensuring the quality and integrity of the currency, as well as providing essential functions like defence, law enforcement, and legal frameworks to safeguard private property rights and ensure the free market operated within the rules of fair competition. So the government in a neoliberalist state certainly has a role. Its role is to ensure the functioning of the market, and in so doing, it can be quite coercive and interventionist in its own way. There are cases where markets do not naturally exist, such as in areas like land and water, education, healthcare, social security, and the environmental regulation, and so on. The state may need to intervene to create markets, or something like markets. In the privatisation of utilities, or state-owned provided health and education, in the UK in the 1980s, the governments under Mrs. Thatcher, John Major, and Tony Blair sought to create pseudo-internal markets, which mimicked the operation of private free markets. The internal market in the British Health Service, or a kind of market where schools compete against each other for pupils, or private train companies competed against each other for operation on a state-organised and run rail track, were not exactly free markets, but they were like free markets. And the idea was they would benefit from the effects of the efficiencies and natural invisible hand operating principles of supply and demand. Neoliberalism can be categorized into two main themes: the relationship between the state and the economy, and the impact on individuals. Key elements of neoliberalism include privatizing state-owned utilities and expanding market competition. This involves reducing the state's direct role in managing utilities such as communication networks, rail systems, healthcare, and water supply, by transferring ownership to private entities and introducing competition, or, as we said before, pseudo-competition, with the state operating by proxy through some sort of regulatory body to ensure, again, the rules are being followed, or some minimum level of provision, recognizing as it does that the logic of the free market can sometimes mean not providing something at all. The state, therefore, becomes a distributor of contracts to private providers or autonomous agencies or trusts which behave like private enterprise. So in the UK, schools now compete for pupils, and the sick may, if they wish, consider which hospital kills fewer patients, and shop around. Neoliberalism asserts that privatisation and market competition enhance efficiency by encouraging innovation, responsiveness to consumer needs, and cost-effectiveness. Another significant aspect of neoliberalism is advocating for lower taxes, especially on wealth and corporations, to stimulate wealth creation. Here's Liz Truss, the short-lived Prime Minister of the UK, advocating for lower taxes.
We need to unleash business across Britain. We need people to want to invest in our country. We need businesses to be able to expand, to grow, to create new jobs, to create new ideas. That's why I'm calling upon the Chancellor at the autumn statement to put corporation tax back down to 19%. And frankly, if we can get it lower, the better. Because what we know is that when businesses are able to keep more of those funds, the future comes from. It's where the opportunities come from. It's where the jobs come from. Because what we know is that economic growth and making Britain grow again is not going to be delivered by the Treasury. It's not going to be delivered by more public spending. It's not going to be delivered by more regulation. It's going to be delivered by giving businesses the freedom they need to succeed. It's going to be propelled by that.
That's Liz Truss, former British Prime Minister, talking to an American libertarian think tank in 2023. You notice it's all there: suspicion of government, trust in free markets, and twice the repeated phrase, what we know. We know this. It's the truth. It's simply what we know to be true. This is the remarkable sense of discovery, of having found the truth that lies at the heart of neoliberalism. Like the philosopher Robert Nozick, the state becomes a watchman, a night watchman, minimal, possibly repressive, possibly quite strict in the areas where it does operate to maintain the free market, but certainly, as Nozick suggested, it should leave people's money in their pockets. For Nozick, it was actually immoral to take taxes off of people, akin to theft. For Liz Truss, taxes are simply economically not a good idea, since they restrict money flowing around in the free market, which does it and spends it and invests it a whole lot better. What about the poor? Neoliberalism and classical liberalism is often associated with the idea of the trickle-down. If people, driven by their own desires to make money, do indeed make an awful lot of money, that money works its way through the system. They spend it, they invest it. There's only so much money a billionaire can keep for themselves. They spend it on space rockets, or they spend it on vanity projects, or they spend it on strange scientific enterprises. It eventually makes its way into the hands of the workers, the engineers, and so on. In this sense, the enormously wealthy will, by a slow process of trickle-down economics, benefit everybody. In the 1990s, Peter Mandelson, advisor, government minister, and famous spin doctor of Labour, or New Labour, under the Blair government, asserted that he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. The filthy rich, no matter how filthily rich they are, in the end, are good for all of us, if you believe trickle-down economics. So, we can see that neoliberalism argues that reducing taxes can incentivize investment, spur economic growth, and ultimately benefit both companies and consumers. A high tide lifts every boat. If the wealth gap widens, it's not an issue as long as the lower economic strata also improves. This concept sees economic growth as expanding businesses, which in turn hire more workers, driving competition for labour and wages. Improved conditions encourage spending, as individuals with higher incomes support other businesses, stimulating the economy. This economic principle extends benefits to a broader population over time. To foster wealth creation, the approach includes reducing taxes and letting the market determine wealth distribution. Proponents argue that this neoliberal approach is more effective than state intervention, which they believe can be inefficient. This idea that governments will waste your money, spend it inefficiently, runs right through the late 20th century governments of Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, and so on. Ronald Reagan is famous for observing that government doesn't solve problems. Government is the problem. So, in the 1980s, 90s, and following decades, governments were praised for deregulation, for sweeping away that terrible thing that loomed like a monster in the corner of the room, red tape. Red tape had been swept aside. Regulations got away with, which were seen as tangling up, as they might be portrayed in political cartoons, tangling up the entrepreneur, the free spirit, with health and safety gone mad regulations, which benefited no one and restricted the growth that would benefit us all in the long run. This view of government sees neoliberals tap into the historic liberal view of government as a necessary evil. We should be wary of government. We should watch it like a hawk. It will waste our money and tax us unnecessarily. This, for an individual living in a neoliberalist society, meant being part of a flexible workforce. In the 1980s, the Conservative minister Norman Tebbit urged the unemployed to get on their bikes. Go and look for a job. Don't sit at home. Advocates emphasise the benefits of temporary and part-time work arrangements, zero-hour contracts, the Uber economy, which they believe offers more options for both employers and employees. In this sense, employees are commodities, and they should be bought and sold or trade their own labour as easily and unrestrictedly as possible. Being able to remove workers, hire and fire them, benefits a free market. In 1978, the economist Milton Friedman gave a series of lectures at Stanford University in which he explained to his audience why the minimum wage and welfare in the United States could explain unemployment among African Americans. The mechanism, he said, involved welfare dependency and removing the incentive for employers to employ African Americans, since, having poor educational skills, they would inevitably be priced out of the market because of the minimum wage. The logic of this is that wages should be allowed to fall until even the most ill-educated and unemployable person is cheap enough to employ, even at starvation wages, or less. In this sense, Friedman sees the market as operating efficiently and effectively in some areas, i.e., making certain types of employee more attractive if they could be priced back into employment, but it doesn't seem to work on people themselves. In other words, incentives to become more educated and therefore qualify for jobs that earn the minimum wage doesn't seem to work on them. So one of the problems for neoliberalism, as we shall see, was rather selective application of the impact of competition. It seemed to incentivize some people and not others.
The period in which you had the greatest improvement in the lot of the ordinary man was the period of the 19th and early 20th century. Those of us in this room are the heirs of that. We benefited from the way in which our parents and our grandparents were able to come here. And by virtue of the freedom that was offered to them, were able to make a better life for themselves and them and us. But next, if you look at the real problems of poverty and denial of freedom to people in this country, almost every single one of them is a result of government action and would be eliminated if you eliminated the bad government failures. Let me be precise and specific. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate among black teenagers? It's a disgrace and a scandal. Why do we have so high an unemployment rate? First of all, because we give them lousy schooling through governmental schools, which make them unqualified to hold decent jobs. And second of all, we require employers to discriminate against them by not hiring them unless their productivity is enough to justify a minimum wage. The minimum wage rate having first not enabled the young blacks to have a decent schooling so that they can have productivity, we next deny them the on-the-job training that they might get if you could induce employers by being able to hire them for relatively low wages to give them on-the-job training that would make them qualify for higher payment and higher productivity. In the third place, we have constructed a governmental welfare scheme which has been a machine for producing poor people. We have induced people to come under control of welfare. I'm not blaming the people, don't misunderstand me. It's our fault for constructing so perverse and so ill-shaped a monster.
Another aspect of neoliberalism involves ensuring the stability of the currency. This became a particular, almost obsession under the Thatcher government. Mrs. Thatcher adopted the ideas of Milton Friedman, and this became known as monetarism in the early 80s. Governments are urged in this system to prioritize maintaining the strength and reliability of money to prevent inflation. This shift in focus from prioritizing reducing unemployment to reducing inflation marked a significant change in government priorities in the 1980s. High unemployment could be tolerated as a means of defeating inflation. Unemployment then, as it rose in the early 80s, was seen as a necessary purgative to inflation. Neoliberalism views human nature as naturally entrepreneurial. Individual freedom, in both liberal and neoliberal perspectives, involves the ability to choose one's work and sell one's labour for a wage that reflects its value in a free market. Once again, this is a philosophical suggestion about what the virtuous human being should be like, an individual, as Mrs. Thatcher observed. Society is made of individuals. There's really no such thing as society, just individuals. This wasn't just an observation, if indeed she made it. This wasn't just an observation of the way things are, it's the way things should be for people to live dignified and virtuous lives. Neoliberals also see individuals as rational, what's known as the savvy consumer, making wise purchasing choices. This ensures progressive improvements in efficiency and capability, a kind of market Darwinism. People exercise their creative spirit by identifying market gaps and creating services or products to fill them, as well as purchasing or not purchasing those products which are most or less effective. You can see this represented in the series on British television, The Dragon's Den, where would-be entrepreneurs pitch their ideas to a group of successful capitalists who review them from the point of view of whether they have indeed found that thing, the gap in the market. If they have, they must be advanced with investment. Neoliberalism also advocates for reducing welfare and the welfare state, limiting the number and amount of benefits to reduce dependency. This presents a contradiction in neoliberalism, since human nature, from a neoliberalist standpoint, is therefore both naturally driven to seek opportunity, but also liable to become lazy and dependent. Neoliberals share this suspicion of human fallibility with neoconservatives. At the same time, the human spirit is characterized by go-getting energy and lethargy. Neoliberals believe that individuals and markets are best suited to determine needs, advocating for choice in services like healthcare to encourage competition and better outcomes. However, they criticize welfare dependency, so in this sense, choice can only go so far. You're not free to choose not to take part in the market. You're not free to choose not to work. This is an echo of the 18th century philosopher Rousseau's observation that it may be necessary to force people to be free. Prior to neoliberalism's emergence in the mid-20th century, the dominant economic theory was Keynesianism, named after the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism emerged as a response to the economic crisis of the late 1920s and 1930s, gaining prominence post-World War II. Central to Keynesianism is the concept of the state as a spender of last resort, intervening in the economy through spending on infrastructure and employment. Keynesian economics proposes that governments should stimulate demand to promote economic growth. Advocates of this theory asserted that consumer demand is the primary driver of economic activity. Consequently, Keynesian economics advocates for expansionary fiscal policies, utilizing tools such as government spending on infrastructure, unemployment benefits, and education. Keynes was a liberal thinker. He formulated this theory in the 1930s amidst the backdrop of the Great Depression, which had proven resistant to previous free market rules and solutions. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented Keynesian principles as part of his transformative New Deal program. Within his first 100 days in office, FDR increased the national debt by $3 billion, a huge sum, and unprecedented at the time, to establish 15 new agencies and a plethora of laws. Notably, initiatives like the Works Progress Administration, which employed 8.5 million individuals, while the Civil Works Administration created 4 million construction jobs. Keynesian ideas became integral to the economic policies of both Labour Party and the Conservatives right up until the 1980s, shaping what became known as the post-war consensus. Governments in Britain and across the world thought that Keynesian ideas were how you ran the economy. When the economy slowed, you invested. When the economy boomed, you taxed. Between 1945 and 1979, these ideas dominated economic thought. Keynes had articulated his theories in the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which was a groundbreaking work published in 1936. As a progressive liberal, Keynes believed that government intervention was essential in mitigating economic downturns. Understanding the disproportionate impact of economic crises on marginalised populations, Keynes endorsed policies aimed at guaranteeing their freedom from unemployment and poverty. By extension, then, Keynesian economics and welfare and the creation of welfare states, of socialised medicine, and of nationalising parts of the economy to preserve their integrity went together as a package for most of the governments, Conservative and Labour, up until 1979. In the 1970s, Keynesianism was facing a crisis due to economic challenges, which led directly to the rise of neoliberalism, or rather, neoliberalism came in from the cold. In the 1970s, economies across the world, particularly in Britain and the United States, saw a combination of inflation and economic stagnation, which under Keynesianism was largely not supposed to exist side by side. That is to say, prices were going up, wages were going up, and the economy was shrinking. This was called stagflation. Keynesianism didn't seem to be able to fix it, since investing in the economy seemed to stimulate inflation, and the benefits simply frittered away like throwing water across sand. The first phase of neoliberalism, which appeared in the 1970s, wasn't in the UK, but in Latin America, such as in the dictatorship in Chile. The historian Neil Davidson categorizes the implementation of neoliberalism into vanguard neoliberalism, 1979 to 92, and social neoliberalism. The former saw right-wing neoconservative leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher championing neoliberalist policies. The latter saw centre-left governments, such as Blair and Clinton, adopting similar neoliberalist economic views. In the United States, Clinton supported workfare, by which welfare was dependent on seeking and getting work. Labour's public-private partnerships, or PPPs, which involved private capital financing government projects and services, and then drawing revenues from taxpayers and or users for profit over the course of a PPP contract. In essence, contracting out investing in the economy to private entrepreneurs. Vanguard neoliberalism aimed at functional changes, such as tax rate adjustments, weakening organised labour, such as breaking the power of the miners during the miners' strike in the UK, or the mass sacking of air traffic controllers in the USA under Ronald Reagan. It also involved the privatisation of state utilities and the introduction of market competition. This period was often combined with neoconservative ideologies, emphasising individual responsibility and limiting welfare through tough law and order policies. This combination simultaneously saw privatisation, welfare cuts, and a huge increase in the prison population in the UK and USA. Left-of-centre governments like Tony Blair's New Labour administration in the UK and Bill Clinton's New Democrats in the US saw the adoption of similar policies. During this period, marketisation and extending markets continued into new areas, all under the guise of empowering people. Schools and hospitals became trusts. The introduction of tuition fees being an example. This was portrayed as a way to empower working-class individuals to access higher education. The increased marketisation and emphasis on choice during this period was presented as empowering people beyond traditional inequalities based on class, disability, gender, race, and other factors. The ideal was a meritocracy. The market would facilitate a fairer society. Beyond this, though, neoliberalism was also a way of reordering social reality and of rethinking our status as individuals. It's not simply a name for pro-market policies or for the utilizing of resources of finance capitalism for social aims. It is also a realignment of cultural values asserting that competition is the only legitimizing, organizing principle for human activity. The value of art, value of education, personal success, and indeed personal identity become commodified by market principles that are measurable and monetized. In this sense, neoliberalism is a cultural transformation. While it is fair to say that neoliberalism has come to dominate our cultural and economic and political lives for the better part of the last 40 or 50 years, it has not gone without its critics, to such an extent that we might see neoliberalism having run its course. It's certainly being challenged as never before. One of the factors which has led people to question the neoliberalist consensus is the expansion of inequality. The stark increase in inequality has not been accompanied by the promised trickle-down effect, resulting in a disproportionate concentration of wealth among a top percentile, and at the same time increasingly impoverished and difficult lives for the poor, or indeed for most of the rest. This rise in inequality has been particularly evident in the Western world. The gap between the rich and the poor grew steadily, with the top 10% of households in the UK owning 57% of the wealth, while the bottom 50% owning less than 5%. And as the wealthy became richer and the poor became poorer, and food banks, unknown under the welfare state, began to appear as commonplace, and lifespan began to contract for the first time since the mid-19th century, this threatened social cohesion, with anger directed at immigrants or imagined conspiracies, or the desire to exit the European Union, may be seen as a direct consequence of the frustration and anger and sense of powerlessness that people who voted for Brexit wish to reassert over their lives, and an incoherent, poorly articulated sense of unfairness which pervaded society. Secondly, the issue of gender inequality within the context of neoliberalism has been highlighted by many feminists. The ideal of the neoliberalist individual, portrayed as an entrepreneurial seeker of freedom and opportunity, fails to consider the unique challenges faced by women, who often bear a disproportionate burden of the care responsibility. The reframing of families as economic units, where the prime objective is to boost employability, has recruited millions of women into part-time and low-paid work which has become an essential feature of family life to maintain economic security. The irony is a flexible market which traps families into rigidities of working in order to just about manage. Not much freedom there. Thirdly, there is the recurring criticism of capitalism that it has no regard for social justice or environmental protections, such as providing essential services like childcare or addressing climate change. These collective problems do not align with profit-driven market forces. A good example is building affordable housing in the UK. Affordable homes are not as profitable as large executive-style homes, and since the housing market is most profitable when housing is scarce, the market acts as a disincentive for building more homes. This can be seen in the private rented market for housing. The idea that landlords would compete to provide quality housing has not materialized. Landlords capitalize on scarcity by charging exorbitant rents for substandard housing, exploiting desperate tenants to charge huge rents. Government after government, think tank after think tank, Journalistic report after journalistic report show that Britain needs to build houses, and yet the market does not provide an answer, even though the demand is substantial. Overall, the notion of the pure market, where supply and demand operate with huge efficiency, seen as a cornerstone of neoliberalism, has been challenged as unrealistic and utopian. Neoliberals depict the market as rational, unbiased, a system that responds and reacts accordingly. However, markets do not operate freely or rationally. One key example is the implementation of tuition fees, where fees escalated from £1,000 in the late 1990s to £9,000 and beyond in 2010 under the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition. The justification for raising tuition fees, often forgotten now, was based on a premise of competition. The expectation was that universities would set their fees between £1,500 and £9,000, offering diverse options for students. The more prestigious universities might charge £9,000, the less, lower fees in order to attract students. In reality, all universities immediately opted to charge £9,000 a year, negating the notion of student choice. Another example of irrationality is the banking crisis of 2008. Banks engaged in investment practices which were highly profitable but ultimately led to the banking crash. In hindsight, rational thought could have seen that it was unsustainable, that it depended on a belief, almost a faith, a leap of faith, that markets would just carry on going on forever, that prices of property would simply rise forever, even though that had never been true in human history. This suspension of rationality led to the markets crashing, banks dissolving in the great banking crisis of 2008, which in hindsight was a substantial failure of neoliberalist principles. Also, the privatisation of state utilities in the UK was intended to foster competition and choice among consumers. However, in reality, a few dominant companies monopolised these markets, limiting consumer options and dictating industry standards. Whether it was the water companies or the electricity providers, real competition didn't last, and monopolies and market rigidities reasserted themselves, and choice disappeared. The water companies stand out as an example. Water companies, privatised water providers, found that it made more sense to dump sewage in rivers and pay the penalties than invest in new sewers. They also found that water regulation restricted their freedom to raise water bills, while investors would not invest without healthy profits. The result is that private water companies provide a poor service. Customers are dissatisfied because they see profits being made while sewage is dumped. So over the last few decades, privatisation of water has seen a steady decay in water infrastructure in the UK. The disaster of marketising of utilities is becoming steadily more apparent. A fundamental flaw in neoliberal ideology lies in its narrow view of human nature, which sees individuals as purely profit-driven economic agents. This one-dimensional view neglects the diverse motivations and obligations that drive individuals beyond profit-seeking activities. The failure to account for these multifaceted aspects of human behaviour contributes to many of the criticisms directed towards neoliberalism. For example, millions who decided not to work after the pandemic because they preferred to escape the rat race and accept lower incomes and standard of living. Here's Dr. Abby Innes talking about her book, Late Soviet Britain. In this extract, she's placing the failure of neoliberalism to fully understand human nature into a wider philosophical perspective.
In terms of ontological indeterminacy, where this is particularly important for the social sciences as distinct from the natural sciences is that social scientists are always examining people who are also examining themselves and each other. We are imaginative. We're not like gravity. We change our minds about what we think we're doing and when we're going to do it. And consequently, social science is always dealing with this contingency that because we are imaginative and there are new technologies and there are emerging novelties in complex systems, the social world is always becoming something else. And that means that we have this kind of inalienable, provisional nature of what we're doing when we're social scientists. So the idea that the economy is a watch and like God the watchmaker, we know how it works, which is the neoclassical conceit, would require everyone to operate like cogs in that watch and to also understand the entire mechanism so as not to breach its boundaries and change its structure, basically. So essentially what Soviet economics and neoliberal economics share is that they're basically secular theologies dressed up as sciences that are claiming to be scientific, but essentially they are claiming that they have transcended everything we know about the philosophy of science and have understood history directly. The riddle of history is solved. They have solved it, and we should govern according to those philosophies. So where the dark historical comedy comes in is because they're mirror image utopias. When you've got to translate the ideology into a procedure, they converge on exactly the same statecraft. They converge on the statecraft of quantification, output planning, target setting, managerial correct lines, the idea that all corporations will only be system consistent, all enterprises that are developed within the scope of the ideology must conform to the predictions of the ideology, so they'll only be socially productive. How's that going? They'll be efficient cogs in the systemic machine, whether that's the Soviet machine or the neoliberal machine. And of course, almost immediately, that turns out not to be the case.
Recently, the 2008 economic crash led to the rise of populist leaders. Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, and the populist right, who identify conspiracy, immigrants, fear of the other as to blame for our current travails. The populist right has also promoted increased government intervention in the economy. Protectionism, as America puts up barriers against Chinese goods, Britain, for security reasons, does similar, and trade barriers have returned, and the move towards global free trade has faltered. Globalization itself falters. However, neoliberalist ideologies persist in various policies implemented post-crisis and post-COVID. Austerity measures, tax cuts, market-oriented solutions have been hallmarks of government responses. Even the new Labour government, under Keir Starmer, is keen to assert that it doesn't ignore sound economic principles. And the rise of populism of the right, which initially appeared to challenge neoliberalism, the underlying emphasis on individual freedom and the distrust of elites, align with neoliberalist values. The influence of neoliberalism on society has been profound and enduring. It isn't only that free markets produce a tiny number of winners and an enormous number of losers, and the losers are looking for revenge and have turned to Brexit and Trump. There was from the beginning an inevitable contradiction between the utopian ideal of the free market and the dystopian reality of food banks, debt, decaying services, hospitals and schools, the pervasive insecurity, inequality, and the venality among office holders and corporate executive bosses. So it may be that we are in the twilight of neoliberalism. It may be, as capitalism tends to do, evolve into something else. So we will have post-neoliberalism, neo-neoliberalism, neoliberal Keynesianism. Well, watch this space. That brings to an end this episode of the Politics Shed podcast. Please use the Politics Shed website to understand further the world of neoliberalism and conservatism and liberalism and ideology. Thank you for listening.